So you wait a few minutes until the rest show up? Oh.
Who are interested in gardening. And as Matthew said, if you have any questions, just send them in the chat room and send the questions over to Matthew, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. It's always much more fun, but we'll try to do it this way. All right, so I'm going to go. So most of the time when we think about pollinators, we tend to think of this little guy. This is the honeybee. And he's certainly been in the news a lot. There are some problems that they're having with the colony collapse and all the rest. But the honeybees are sort of like the cows of the insect world. They are the creatures, they are sort of a domesticated insect. And they were brought over to New England and the New World in 1622 to help the colonists with their plants. A lot of their plants were pollinated by the honeybees. They were concerned that there weren't any bees here to pollinate their plants, so they brought them with them. And they also wanted honey and wax, because these really are the only bees that make sizable quantities of both honey and wax. And so, you know, we really need honeybees. They pollinate an awful lot of our food. There are all sorts of statistics about how many bites they take that they're pollinated. And it's a big business. Honeybees are shipped around the country. They follow the crops as they bloom. They are vital to the pollination of a lot of these crops. So here, you know, we have, you know, they do, you know, about half of the species plant species depend on animals for pollinators, not just bees. And bees help produce plants and fruits and seeds that, you know, the birds and other animals eat. And they help keep the plant communities healthy by cross-pollinating these plants. But we should not forget that Connecticut has a lot of its own bees. And these are our native bees. And some of them we don't tend to think of because their names are not as familiar, but I love the names of our local bees: plaster bees, mason bees, sweat bees, cuckoo bees, and then of course the bumblebees that we all know. But over 300 species of native bees. And each of those bees requires certain things in order to thrive. And we need these bees as well as the honeybees. The honeybees are generalists. They can pollinate a wide variety of things, but the native bees are actually more efficient at pollinating a lot of the plants. And that's because they are specialized to pollinate certain plants. I love this pollinator efficiency. Honeybees are only 72%, while native bees are up to 91%. They are designed, a lot of the flowers are designed for the native bees, and the bees are designed to pollinate those native flowers. So that's why their efficiency is so high. Unfortunately, we're losing some of our native bees. 4 different species of native bumblebees have vanished in the last 20 years, and some in just the last 10 years. And that's a bit concerning. Why are we losing these bees? This is not because of colony collapse like with the honeybees. So what is making life difficult for the bees? We want to help the bees, we've got to know what the problems are. Well, part of the problem is a lot of our landscapes used to look like this. We used to have meadows with flowers. And these were native flowers for the native bees. But when you look outside, you just don't see these very often. We've lost a lot of the meadow habitat as Connecticut has become reforested. And we've lost a lot of our native plants. There's not, you know, you look in a lot of backyards, there is not much there for a bee to go after. And we're fastidious in our gardens. We like to mow everything down. So the lawn is really sort of a biological dead area. Not many insects really like lawn, and there's really no food for almost anything with the lawn. So again, it's no food for the bees. So this has been a big problem. We have a lot of lawn in Connecticut. As a matter of fact, we have more lawn in Connecticut than we have farm fields. And then we have a lot of plants in our landscape that really are not particularly suited to bees. We have a lot of invasive plants. We have a lot of non-native plants. And the non-native plants are designed for the insects back in the old country where they came from, whether it's Asia or Europe. They are not necessarily designed to bloom at the right time or provide the particular kind of nectar and pollen that the native bees like. And then there's the problem of our chemical use in our gardens. You can go, I love this bag, kills 100 insects. Well, included in those insects would be bees, but they don't list them down here. This is the school of only good insects, a dead insect. And then if we're killing weeds, a lot of weeds feed our native bees and a lot of other bees, insects. So when we kill off the weeds, we also kill off some of the food for those animals. There are new classes of pesticides and the neonicotinoids. that have been thought to be made, coincidentally, they came on the market just when the 4 native bee species declined, 4 of the native bee species. There's some thought that the bees may be attracted to the plants with the neonicotinoids in them because it is nicotine after all, and the bees may be affected by that. But it does affects much more than the bees. It affects all sorts of other animals in the food web. And of course, with all the transportation of bees, there's always the risk for an accident and escape of the commercial bees, and the exposure to diseases that are in the commercial beehives. So the question is, how can we help? And that's what brings us here tonight. We're thinking about how we can help those bees. Well, it's bee-friendly gardening. If we plant as many flowers as we can for the bees, that would certainly help. The bees need that nectar and the pollen to not only sustain themselves, but to sustain their larvae. So this is very important. And we have to keep in mind that how the native bees came to be, why there's so many, and it has to do with coevolution. There are a lot of bees that are designed for a particular kind of plant, and it's oligolectic, means that they forage for the particular pollen in a specific plant. It means that plant has the nectar and pollen of the right quality and the chemical composition that supports that particular native bee in its life cycle. And sometimes you can see this connection. Here we have trout lily, which is this lovely little spring wildflower that blooms just at the time that the minor bee, Adrena erythronium, breaks its winter dormancy and comes out to feed. And you can see the connection between these plants, the erythronium and in the name of the plant, and then you can see the Adrena erythronium. Means that there's a connection. That minor bee feeds primarily on that trout lily. So a lot of bees, are very specific. And if you lose that particular plant, you also lose, in many times, that particular insect. There's that closer connection. And you can, and then some of the native wildflowers offer just the right amount of nectar for a bee. In this case, we have a cardinal flower. This is the cultivar. You can see the hummingbird going for it. But sometimes, when a plant is blooming, they have to make a decision. When they're photosynthesizing, the energy they make when they're making food for themselves, when they're out in the sun, drinking up water, breathing in carbon dioxide, they have decisions to make. How many leaves? How many roots? How much stem? How many flowers? How much nectar? How much pollen? These are all costs to the plant, and they have to trade off. And if a plant is bred to make a lot of flowers and a lot of petals to look good for us, sometimes that comes at the cost of the nectar and the pollen. There's only so much energy the plant has. And what the scientists are finding, that the native plants, even though they might not be as showy to us, they have a higher quality of nectar and a higher quality of pollen because of that energy budget the plants have. So it's something to think about when we're planting. But of course, if you want bees, you have to think throughout the whole growing season. Here in Connecticut, our growing season starts sometime in April, depending on the severity of the winter, and ends with the hard frost at the end of October. And there are bees that will come out in the early spring, in the late spring, the middle, throughout the summer, and then there are bees that come out at the later part of the season. There are different species of bees that come out at these different times of year. So when we're thinking of supporting those bees, especially the native bees, we're thinking about we need to plant for the entire season, which is nice because we enjoy the flowers as well. But don't just limit yourself to thinking about flowers on the little perennials or the annuals. Think about the trees. The red maple, although it's not particularly showy to us, although it, when you see those little red buds, you know that the spring is coming. The bees, the early season bees, go for the nectar. You don't usually think of them as a flowering tree, but those are the flowers. They're insignificant to us, but vital to the early bees. And the same thing with shadblow. Shadblow is one of the early blooming trees. It'll bloom earlier than the crab apples. They bloom at the time of the year when the shad fish used to migrate upriver. These are a very important plant for early season bees. And shrubs and trees are great bees. If you don't have room for a lot of perennials, you don't want to go to the trouble of a lot of perennials, think shrubs, because they take up a lot of space and provide an awful lot of bloom for the bees. These are very important plants. And then even down to the end of the year, the witch hazels, this Virginiana, Hamalis virginiana, is the late season. It will bloom in November, or October, November, and on a nice warm November day, you can see the bees out getting the last little bit of nectar before they go into their dormancy for the winter. So the shrubs and trees are very important. This is a shot taken a few years ago at the Roaring Brook Nature Center, our bird and butterfly garden. It started off as a butterfly garden, but very quickly evolved into a bird garden because I noticed that the birds were using it as much as the bees. And when you look at that picture, your eye is drawn to, the bright pink and the yellow and things. But the most important pollinator plant in this garden, the one that I am the most excited about, is that plant. This is a mountain mint. And if you want a pollinator plant in your garden, if you have no room for any other thing, and you just want the pollinators in July and August, this time of the year, get a mountain mint. There's thin leaf mountain mint and a regular mountain mint with a broader leaf. The insects, the pollinating insects, are absolutely besotted by this. I don't know if any of you have ever grown Monarda or bee balm, which is a great bee magnet. That one pales in comparison to the mountain mints. And these bees are so happy and content and fixated on this plant that I've gone up to them and patted the bees on the back, and they could have cared less. They left me alone, no stinging, because they are so besotted by this plant. And speaking of stinging, a lot of our native bees, because they are not colony bees like the honeybees, do not sting unless really provoked. They do not sting because they are not protecting the nest the way the honeybees are starting. So attracting the native bees to the flowers does not mean that you will have more bee stings. Actually, probably fewer bee stings. But this plant is an absolute must in a bee garden. And then if you're going to be planting plants, you have to think like a bee and know certain things about bees. Bees have a different color vision than we do. They do not see in the reds, the oranges, the reds colors that we see. Their color spectrum is shifted over, but they can see in ultraviolet light, which we cannot see. We can see up to violet, but they can see beyond violet in the ultraviolet range. So it means that things look different to them. Here is the flower that we would see, but when that flower is photographed under ultraviolet light, it is seen like that. And these little lines going into the flower are called nectar guides. This is the way the flower signals to the bee, saying, come here. They're like the lines on the highway or the runway on an airport telling the planes where to go. These are signals to the bee to say, this is where the nectar is. They're guiding them in. We don't see them. And the question is, when we cultivate flowers, are those lines still there? We don't really know that answer yet. And it's fascinating how a bee finds the flowers. Certainly the flower will give off a scent to attract the bee. It will have petals that are different from the leaves to attract the bee. But there's also an electrical charge for the bee. The earth has a negative charge, and flowers, which are attached to the earth, have a negative charge. And bees, as they're flying through the air, and same thing with airplanes and other things, when they're flying through the air, they pick up a positive charge. And when the positive charge of the bee comes near the negative charge of the flower, that's when all those little hairs on the bee start to stand up on end. Sort of like if you took a balloon and rubbed it against your head, your hair would all stand on end. Well, the same thing with the bee. And the bee will get that tingling sensation as it approaches a flower that hasn't been visited by other bees, that is loaded with nectar. But the more bees that visit that flower, the positive charge from the bee will neutralize the negative charge of the flower. So the next bee that comes by, or the next couple of bees that come by, will not get that tingling sensation, and they'll know that that flower is empty of its nectar, and they'll fly on. So there's this connection between the plants talking to the insects and the insects picking up the plant. Another benefit of having that positive charge and the pollen having the negative charge is that quite often the pollen will actually jump up and cover the bee. And this is because it's so small, the bee, it'll stick to all those little hairs. It's one of the reasons a lot of the bees have those hairs. They'll gather the pollen, they'll collect it, put it in their pollen baskets, and fly off. But they don't really have to collect it as much as fly near, and that pollen will fly onto them. But there are different kinds of pollination. The honeybees will go up to a flower, and of course, with the pollen will fly on them. But the bumblebees are a fascinating group. They're called buzz pollinators. And what happens with the bumblebees is they're able to dislocate their flight wings and shake themselves at a certain vibration that shakes the pollen out of the tubes up here. A lot of the plants, the bumblebees pollinate are specialized to be only pollinated by the bumblebees. And about 9% of the world's flowers require that. And a lot of things like tomatoes and potatoes and a lot of the New World crops have these things, these anthers where the pollen is, and they're fused, and the pollen has to be shaken out. And in greenhouses now, bumblebees are taken in to pollinate hothouse tomatoes and things like that. So it's kind of, and it's no coincidence that things like tomatoes and peppers and squash and all, those are New World foods, and they are pollinated by the insects of the New World, North American insects. And then you also have to consider that some bees have short tongues and some bees have long tongues. And this poses a problem for some of the bees. The flowers with a long corolla, the short-tongued bees can't get to the nectar. If it's a daisy like this, a long-tongued or short-tongued bee can go there, but the short-tongued bees are very effective at getting the pollen, and so they will visit these flowers more frequently. And the bees with the long tongue will visit the flowers with the long throat or corolla. And sometimes they cheat. If you've ever seen a blueberry bush in bloom, go up and look very closely at its flowers, and often you'll see these little holes on the side. And that's because some of the short-tongued bees were not able to get their tongues into the flower to get the nectar the traditional way, shall we say, and instead they chew a little hole on the side so they can get their short tongues in and drink up the nectar anyway. So, interesting adaptation. So a lot of flowers provide, the flower is really the landing pad, the signaling device to say, come, pollinate me, and that is really what the bees want. They want the nectar, provides fuel for themselves. They'll take it back and make the honey with that nectar, which is, honey is really just sort of regurgitated nectar and evaporated, and then the pollen they will use to make something called bee bread and to feed themselves and their young. And you know, in the fall, asters are a fantastic food for these bees. Then you have to start thinking, remember I said you have to think like a bee. If you were a bee, which one of these would you like to go visit? Well, the obvious answer is the native one. It's got the landing pads, it's signaling, it's got the nectar and the pollen all available for the bee. In this one, often these double flowers, which look great to us, are absolutely useless to bee. In this case, the flower has spent all of its energy on making petals. It probably doesn't have any energy left over to make any nectar, and besides, where would you find it? It's just sort of a hot mess. Although to us looks gorgeous, to a bee, not so much. So, and then not only the plants that you choose, but how are you going to plant them? Often when I go to the nurseries, I try to buy 3 or 5 or something so, you know, you can plant it. But, you know, plants are expensive. It's hard. Sometimes you have to wait, you know, for it to grow and divide. And it's so tempting. There's so many plants out there, not this year because the supply chain was sort of disrupted by the pandemic, but there's so many plants to choose from, and you want one of each. And then you get this sort of thing like polka dot planting, one of these, one of those, one of these, one of those. And the bees find that very confusing. Bees tend to, even the honeybees tend to the honeybees that are born at a certain time tend to specialize on a couple of flowers. They learn how to get the nectar from a couple of flowers. So the more of those flowers you can provide for them, the better. So instead of the polka dot planting, try a mass planting. In different areas of your yard, try to plant large masses of those flowers. It makes it easier for the bees and the other creatures to find them. And water. It's not just birds that need a bird bath. Bees will also drink. they need, especially during this, it's been very dry this spring, hard time to start a garden this year because of the drought we've had. But bees and other insects do need that water for drinking. And then, of course, this is not what you want to do. I love this spring work on feeling one with nature. We need to rethink some of the gardening practices we have. The pesticides, the insecticides particularly, are extremely harmful to the bees and the other pollinators. So you want to just, if you're going to have a butterfly garden, these recreational poisons are not really placed for you. They're not useful. And it's disturbing. The United States Geological Survey found that it's not in the urban streams. They found more pesticides in the urban streams than in the agricultural streams in the country. And that's because when we apply pesticides, we really don't have any training or knowledge of what we're doing. We go by the label on the back of the bag, and we end up using a whole lot more than we need. So it's disturbing. The farmers have to take training and courses, and it's a big business expense for them, so they limit their use of these things. But it's still a recreational activity for the home gardener, and that doesn't work for gardening. And then if you're not applying herbicides to your lawn, you might be surprised by what you get. Violets are a native plant, and they support some of our native insects. And if you have violets and clover in your yard, and clover used to be in grass seed until people decided they didn't want dandelions, which are also a great food source for early pollinators when they break dormancy in the bees in the springtime. But clover is a great plant for bees. So you could have, even if you have a very small garden area, you could have a very big pollinator garden by having clover and violets in your yard. Just set the blade high so that the violets and the clover heads remain. And then in part of your yard, you have to think about the life cycle of the bees. Part of the year they're spending dormant, and usually they're underground. We tend to think of beehives, but that's not what our native bees are doing. They are actually, the queens will winter over, the queen bumblebees will winter over underground, and a lot of the bees will winter solitary nests underground for the winter. So you want to have areas without mulch and with bare soil. So if you can have that in your yard, that will attract the bees to winter over in your yard to be there in the next spring. And you don't want to dig the soil too much, because that will disturb the bees as well. So just leaving an area where nothing happens and it's just bare soil, that will attract the ground nesting bees. And if you do have a yard, think about creating your own meadow. Rather than an area that you have to incessantly mow, let things grow up. And you'd be surprised. I have an area in my backyard, which was where my two sons were supposed to play baseball or soccer or football or whatever, but they didn't do that when they got older. They did crew. They needed a river for that, and I kept mowing this one section of my yard, and I thought, oh, that's pretty ridiculous. So I let it go, and right now it has black-eyed Susan. It has goldenrod. Goldenrod grows really well around here, and is a fantastic pollinator plant for creatures. And just to remind you again, the goldenrod is not the one that gives people hay fevers. It's the ragweed that grows beside it that no one sees. Goldenrod has a big sticky pollen that has to be carried by the insects to be pollinated. It doesn't float in the air. But over time, even if you just leave it alone, if you don't mow it, you can mow paths through it, you can develop your own meadow. It'll speed up if you add things to it, and there are whole studies about how to create a meadow. It's not easy, but it is possible. And with a meadow, you just have to mow it once in a while to keep the woody plants down. As a matter of fact, it's good to leave those stems up, because that is an overwintering habitat for bees. Some bees nest underground. Some bees will overwinter in the stems of the plants, and the seed heads provide food for birds. Now you can go to the trouble of making a bee block, or building your own little bee. There are some bees that like these kinds of things. there are some negative impacts of this. Anytime you bring lots of insects, lots of species together, just like at a bird feeder, there's a chance that the insects might share their germs, animals that would be separated, sort of like what we're going through here. You don't want large gatherings to share germs. Same thing with the insects. So while you can do that, the better thing is to have some stems. There are a lot of plants like elderberry that have pithy stems, and the bees will dig a hole in there and they'll winter inside that stem. So again, you might want to wait on your pruning until the spring, late spring. And then if you do establish a meadow, depending on how large your lot is, if you want a meadow, think about mowing only a portion of it and mowing at certain times of the year. If you mow at certain times of if you mow in the end of August, it will keep it as a grassy meadow, not very good for pollinators. So if you want a bee or pollinating meadow, you need to mow it in the early spring, sort of March, when you find, when you can get out there, or late March when the insects are starting to wake up. And only mow 1/3 of the area per year. That will keep down the woody vegetation, which you don't want. It'll keep it as a meadow, but it will prevent the mower from cutting up all the different insects that are hibernating in that meadow. So it's not just about bees. You also want to, have a habitat for other animals. And when you when you do it for bees, you're making a pollinating garden for other animals. And some of the interesting animals that pollinate are things like beetles. Beetles are good pollinators. Flies will pollinate, even mosquitoes. Male mosquitoes drink nectar. The female mosquitoes need the blood for laying eggs, but male mosquitoes, that's all, they don't drink blood, they just drink the nectar from flowers. And although they're not great pollinators, they will pollinate. And even our first flower of spring, the skunk cabbage, is pollinated by beetles and flies. And here you can see 2 little butterflies that are pollinating. Here's a monarch, and you can see the pollen on its proboscis, and you can see the pollen on the legs. So they're not as effective as bees, but they are still pollinators. And here's, I love this little creature. This is the clear-winged sphinx moth. First time I saw it, I thought, that's the strangest looking hummingbird I've ever seen. And it's got this long tube-like mouth, which can go into these long-throated flowers, and it will still pollinate. Here you can see there's that clear wing, and it's got, the tongue is long enough to go up into these spurs and get the nectar right at the end. So all the butterflies can do that. But if you plant something just because, just because the butterflies like it doesn't mean you should plant it. Here we have a lovely monarch that's drinking nectar from purple loosestrife. And here you see the purple loosestrife in the garden, looks gorgeous, but there's always the possibility that it can escape. And purple loosestrife is one of the ones that did escape and became an invasive plant problem for a while. And although there's lots of food here for the butterflies, there's a problem in that there is no food for the juvenile life phase of the butterfly. It's the same thing with the butterfly bush, which does attract a lot of butterflies, and this is what people plant and say, I've got a butterfly garden. Well, not so much. This only feeds the adults. There is no food there for the larvae. And if you want butterflies in your garden, you have to have food for the butterfly. So I'll take you back to grade 2, the life cycle of the butterfly. The butterfly lays its eggs on a particular leaf. It knows exactly which leaf to lay it on. And if it lays it on the wrong leaf, there aren't the right chemicals in that leaf for the caterpillar to grow and develop. Caterpillars are very specific as to which leaf, most caterpillars are very specific as to which leaf they're going to eat. And then of course they go into a chrysalis stage. So in order to have these guys, you have to have these guys, you have to have the eggs, you have to have the chrysalis. You have to have all 4 stages. So you need holes in your leaves. If you see holes in your leaves, that is a good sign that you have insects in your yard. And right now insects are having a hard time. There's a little bit of an big insect decline. And they're calling it the insect apocalypse. We need to encourage our local insects. You probably all know that book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle. Well, yes, Eric Carle was right. Some caterpillars are very, very hungry. This beautiful little butterfly, the gray hair streak, he is a very ravenous caterpillar. He can eat all 50 different types of plants from 50 different plant families. But he's an exception. Most of our butterflies are extraordinarily picky eaters. They will only eat a few types of plants. So, you know, in the case of the monarch, monarchs need to eat, monarch butterfly caterpillars have to eat milkweed. And that's because this particular, the milkweed makes that milky sap, which contains a lot of nasty chemicals in it, which the caterpillar absorbs into its body, and it protects it from being eaten. That's why it can wander around in this sort of clown costume of yellow and black and white stripes. And it can, when it metamorphoses into an adult, it's got the bright orange color saying, "Don't eat me, I taste terrible." And monarchs absolutely have to lay their eggs on milkweed. If the caterpillars do not have the milkweed, they will not die. I mean, they will not live. And the way, and if you wonder how do they know which leaf it is? Well, they have taste buds on their feet. And when they land on the feet, they taste the leaf and say, "Ah, yes, I remember that taste when I was a little caterpillar. It was great." But butterflies can drink nectar from a wide variety of flowers. They're not picky eaters, but the caterpillars are. So if you want the monarch butterflies, yes, you might have them coming through your yard if you have the flowers, but you want them to be able to stop and complete their life cycle and lay their eggs as well. And that nasty tasting chemical that's in the monarch or the milkweed leaves gets into certain parts of the body. They store it in a certain part of the body so it won't affect them. And here you have a young blue jay eating the monarch butterfly and eating the chemicals from the milkweed, and it's going to be sick, and it's going to say to itself, "I'm not eating the orange ones, they don't taste good." So there's sort of a herd immunity that way for the butterfly. But remember those lovely violets we were talking about in your lawn? If you have violets in your yard, you will have the great spangled fritillary, one of our most common butterflies in Connecticut, because we have an awful lot of violets. And there's a reason for that, but that's for another day. And if you have the violet leaves, then you'll have the great spangled fritillary caterpillar, because the only thing the great spangled fritillary caterpillar will eat are violet leaves. So you have to have the right food in order to have that butterfly. And sometimes you can see it in the name. Here we have a spicebush swallowtail, and here we have a spicebush. The spicebush has particular chemicals in it that are necessary for the growth and development of that particular butterfly. So you can see that the connection between, just like we saw with the bee and the trout lily and the minor bee, the connection between the plant and the plant and the insect. So we have that co-evolution going on. And I think these are the most fascinating caterpillars of all. This is the spicebush caterpillar. When caterpillars go through what they call instars, they grow, their skin gets too tight, they have to shed their skin, and they go through 5 or 6 different stages before they go into cocoon and become a butterfly. In the first instar, because it hasn't eaten the spicebush leaf, which has lots of benzoin in it, it's a lovely fragrance to me. I think it smells like sort of a lemony soap, but a lot of insects don't like it. That's why plants make these chemicals, to make themselves stinky so the other insects won't eat them. Because the caterpillar hasn't eaten as much of the benzoin, it doesn't taste bad to the birds. So instead, to protect itself, it tries to look like a bird dropping. And then as it goes through its other instars, it starts to look more like a little snake. These are fake eye spots, but they look, and it'll raise its head up like a little snake. And any bird coming along or a mouse coming along will say, "Yeah, snake, I'm going to leave." And if that doesn't work, the caterpillar has these 2 little fleshy horns which can stick out, which absolutely reek of concentrated spicebush aroma. And that's enough to send any animal with a sense of smell off. So absolutely fascinating caterpillar, but you won't have them unless you have spicebush. So, and then again, here you can see the hackberry emperor butterfly and the hackberry tree. That's the larval plant. But of course, there are other butterflies that are also attracted to that hackberry tree. As a matter of fact, if you plant the native plants, the insects will come, the butterflies will come. There are many trees that are host plants to the native butterflies. And will provide pollen for the bees. So just by planting the native leaves, you don't really have to know anything about it. they will feed the native insects. You don't have to go any farther than that. Red spotted purples and viceroys like willows and pussy willows. I found that children at the Nature Center don't know about pussy willows anymore. Because it's not a popular plant or things that children know. I encourage you all to plant a pussy willow. They're fun. And even if you have grasses in your garden, there are caterpillars for the skippers, which are a little tiny brown, a whole bunch of little tiny brown, different kinds of butterflies called skippers. The larvae, the caterpillars, eat the grasses on these plants. So they call these skippers, there's so many different ones, they call them the LBJs of the butterfly world. That means little brown jobs. They're sort of like the sparrows of the bird world. So, you don't usually think of grasses as being a butterfly plant, but the native plants are very good. And then rather than thinking of your plants as simply plants that feed the butterflies or feed the bees at a certain time of the year, see if you can't get plants that will do double duty. Most of our native plants will do double duty. If they are visited, if they have flowers, they will be visited by bees and butterflies. If they're visited by bees and butterflies, which is the whole point of pollination, they will produce berries. Those berries then become food for the birds. And here you can see there's a robin eating a dogwood berry. These are the native dogwood berry, and you can see it's just the right size to fit down that bird's mouth, as opposed to the Kusa dogwood berries, which evolved in Asia. Their berries, those big raspberry-like berries, they are food for monkeys in Asia, but our birds can't eat them, so they're kind of a useless tree here. But you'll see that most of the berries on our native plants are just the right size for fitting down the bird's mouth. And of course, that's very important because the bird's going to then digest the plant, and further along down the trail, it will excrete the seed in a nice little fertilized dropping and start the whole process over again. That plant is dispersed by the birds. So it's not just about bees and butterflies, it's about the whole food web, about getting those plants spread throughout the landscape so there can be more bees, more food for the bees, more food for the butterflies, and more food eventually after the flowers have been pollinated for the birds and other wildlife. And this, you can see this in your garden if you leave the seed heads, especially as you get towards the fall, don't cut down your seed heads, because what provided food to the butterflies and bees in the spring or in the summer will then provide food, bird feeders for things like the American goldfinch. They will eat the seeds from this echinacea. So think of the whole cycle. That's really what the gardening cycle should be. It's not just about providing pretty things for us or just flowers for the bees. It should be the whole sequence of not only the sequence of the plants, but the sequence of the insects and the birds. And to learn more about this, I would strongly encourage you all to get this book. This is a book by Douglas Tallamay. He is an entomologist with the University of Delaware. And he wrote this book, Bringing Nature Home, How You Can Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants. And he was looking at it as an entomologist, someone who studies insects, to see how many insects are supported by our native plants as opposed to our non-native plants. And he really revolutionized how I thought about gardening and a lot of other people. This is a really seminal book. It's he writes for the layman. He writes in very good. And if you ever get a chance to see him on in person, we're not doing that anymore for a while, but you can go on to the internet and you can find some of his talks. And he's very inspirational. And what he found, he and his graduate students found, is that on the native plants, especially the woody plants, there might be 35 times more caterpillar biomass on the native plants than on the non-native plants. And to most gardeners, you think, oh my gosh, that's an awful lot of caterpillars. But the thing is, you're not going to see them because other creatures will find them before they do a whole lot of damage. And those creatures are bees. They have those wonderful little beady eyes. They are on the lookout for caterpillars. And you want them to get those caterpillars because otherwise there'd be far too many of them. So here is a mother chickadee. She has found a caterpillar and she has taken it back to her nest. And here's the big thing. Which one is going to get that caterpillar? Well, it will go to the one with the largest mouth. I think it's going to be that one. And once he gets the caterpillar, he's going to close his mouth and go to sleep. Dad will come back with another caterpillar. He's going to go to that nest and he's going to find the next biggest mouth, maybe that one. That one will go to sleep. Mom will be back a few minutes later, putting another caterpillar in that one's mouth. Dad will come back, another caterpillar in that one, and they'll go down until finally, hopefully, this one will get a caterpillar before this one wakes up. Because if there aren't enough caterpillars, this one will get the caterpillar and that one won't. Mom won't divide up that caterpillar and say, oh, well, you got some last time and I'll get you some. No, if there aren't enough caterpillars to go around, only the biggest ones will get the caterpillars and the little ones will not make it. So what Douglas, and how many caterpillars are needed? Well, a lot. The birds will wait from the time the sun comes up in the morning, this time of year, till the sun goes down in the evening. They will make trip after trip after trip. And in order to raise one nest of chickadees, it takes between 5,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of songbirds. That's a heck of a lot of caterpillars. Fortunately, they're not all on little milkweed plants and all like that. They are on the trees and the shrubs and all throughout the landscape on our native plants. What Douglas Talmay found was that where we have native vegetation, we have more bird species and more birds in total. And when we fill our yards with non-native vegetation, the birds scout it out. They can tell this area is not going to, this area's got, you might as well plant plastic flowers. They're not going to be any use to the birds. And of course you want those birds, they're important at keeping some of the other insects that you don't want in your garden down. So there's this whole web of things that you need to do in your garden to think about how it's going to be helpful. You know, the argument is plant in layers, so there's places for the butterflies and the birds and all the other insects to hide from the predators, but we do that anyway. And it's, if you think about butterfly gardening, butterflies like it a little bit messy. They like places to hide. You don't have to be a really, really neat. We have a tendency to garden hard, but not necessarily garden smart. So you can have a much more relaxed, and I love the idea that there's actually a bench here to sit down and enjoy the work. And it doesn't look like they're working that hard. And so they can sit down and enjoy that garden a little bit more. We have to think about why we're gardening. If you're going to have a butterfly garden, leave a few rocks in your garden. Butterflies have to have a place to bask and raise their body temperature before they can fly. Leave an area that gets wet. If you have a driveway with a puddle in it, that's good. Throw some soil in there, and that's where they come. The males need to come and get the minerals so they can reproduce. They get the minerals out of the soil. You know, if you've got rotten fruit or just happen to have some, I love this, dung lying around, this is where the butterflies will come. Again, the males will get it for increases their reproductive ability. You know, the layering in the garden provides shelter from the rain, and you can, but you know, you can see these in the store roosting site. These are not necessary. Instead, a debris shelter, a debris pile like this, you know, old garden clippings in a pile at the back of the yard, or a log pile. These are places that the insects will go, either the bees or the butterflies or other animals will go. These are great habitat spots for the butterflies. And then you have to think about, where did the butterflies go in the winter? Well, some butterflies, like this coral hairstreak, lay their eggs on branches. So be very careful when you prune. You might be pruning off the thing. And they'll lay it on the branch close to where the food source will be for those caterpillars. Some butterflies hibernate as chrysalis underground. I love this one. You can see the spring azure. You can see his striped antennae there underneath in his chrysalis. And some go under the loose bark on a tree. If you've got an old snag or something with loose bark on it, leave it. That's a great habitat for the adult butterflies that will, like the mourning cloak, that will hibernate as adults. And that's why you see them as early butterflies in the spring. They're already set to go. And if you're gardening, think about your leaves as a great asset. This is where the woolly bear caterpillars will hibernate, and the woolly bear caterpillars turn into a pretty nondescript little moth called the Isabella moth, but they're still fun. And those when you use the leaves in your garden, as opposed to mulch, the detritivores, the insects that break that down into wonderful soil, will also be there, and all that that provides sort of a very low cost bird feeder. The birds that come and do that lovely little hopping dance and move the leaves around to get the insects under there. Something that they don't do in mulch. Mulch is sort of biological dead zone as well. But those leaves provide wonderful hibernation spots for lots of those caterpillars before they turn into butterflies. And some butterflies do migrate. The monarchs, the red admirals, and the painted ladies do migrate. Of course, the monarchs are the ones that fly and congregate down in South America, down in Mexico rather, in pine trees. And here, these are all the butterflies that are congregating on the trees. So many butterflies, the branches actually droop. And it's only just this one spot down in Mexico where they go. There's another spot along the California coast. But the butterflies from Connecticut are the ones that will fly all the way down to Mexico. And then next spring, they will come up. They'll maybe get as far as Texas, and then maybe up to Tennessee, and then they'll come up to Connecticut. So the generation by generation, they'll make their way up. But in order to do that trip back up through Connecticut, they have to have milkweed all along the way. And this is where the monarch butterfly associations have been encouraging everyone to plant milkweed, because it's not something that the farmers want to plant. I was talking to a friend today and said that she was up in Vermont and she couldn't get any milkweed at the nurseries because the farmers don't want anyone to plant the milkweed because it's considered a pest in their fields. But it's essential. If you want to have monarch butterflies, you have to have the milkweed. So what we're talking about today is how your garden can be a habitat stepping stone for these creatures, just like that milkweed all the way along from Mexico all the way up to here. But even your garden can be a stepping stone between your home and the next garden, or your home and the next wild area that the bees and butterflies can get to. But it's really with the native plants, and the native plants are sort of, some of the non-native plants are pretty and they will work. They won't necessarily feed the caterpillars, they'll feed the butterflies, they will feed the bees. But if you can think about, trying to put in those native plants, it'll make it even easier. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to do anything. The native plants are pretty resilient to drought. They're pretty resilient to a lot of different things because they know about the crazy New England weather we get. Another book by Douglas Talmay, this was his newest one, it's called Nature's Best Hope. And he is suggesting that if we could all plant in our yards as best we can these native plants and garden with an eye towards these food cycles and food webs and these natural processes, we can do a lot of good. Right now, we have 40 million acres of the United States are planted in lawn. I said in Connecticut, we have more lawn than we have farm fields. Well, those 40 million acres of the United States, and that's mainly east of the Mississippi River, that's an area the size of New England. And Douglas Talmay, in his book, Nature's Best Hope, is putting forth the idea that if we could just take half of the area that we have in lawn, that would be 20 million acres. And if you add that up, that is more, that's a larger area than all of our existing national parks in the lower 48 states. So the Grand Canyon, the Tetons, the Smoky Mountains, all the different areas that we've set aside for nature preservation. We have the chance to make what he calls the homegrown national park. And I think that is really, we can create viable habitat. Because right now we have planted a lot of things from around the world that just aren't working in our landscape, ecologically working in our landscape. So I think this is a very inspiring book. It tells you what we as individuals can do, and you can be part of the giant puzzle of putting the landscape back together so that it works for our bees and pollinators, and then if it works for them, it will also work for the other creatures. And you can make a difference. Next spring, when you're driving around, look at all the forsythia. Now, forsythia doesn't spread by seed. It only spreads by people and by growing up bigger and bigger. And you look around and you can see that garish yellow everywhere. And you can think that each of those things were planted by people. But no, this plant doesn't get used by a lot of insects. It doesn't get visited that often by the bees, so it doesn't really make seeds, so it doesn't spread that way. This is a plant that came from Asia. It's not native. and nobody really likes its leaves, so it's ecologically just not working in the landscape. But think instead if we planted the spice bush, here we have, it doesn't have, you know, the showy flowers of the forsythia, but it does turn a beautiful yellow in the fall, which the forsythia does not. And if you planted these, you would have these wonderful creatures. You'd have those spice bush swallowtails, and you would have the berries that the birds eat. It makes lovely red berries, and the birds eat them. So it really only starts with planting one plant. And if you're going to plant, a native plant is just as easy. It's harder to find, but it's easy. But it's just as easy to plant as a non-native species, and it's well worthwhile ecologically to plant these things, and so that you can have a garden that will attract movement and life. And that's really what gardening should be all about, and making it not just pretty for us, but useful and effective for the animals we share this world with. So I'm going to stop my share screen, and there we are. All right. So I know that's a lot, but do we have any questions?
Yeah, Marjorie, that was great. Thank you so much for doing that. That was really excellent. I mean, I definitely got some ideas from my own yard as I'm sitting out here looking around saying, oh, I could get rid of half of my grass. and
Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
So we have a bunch of questions, so I'll go ahead and if you don't mind, read those off to you, and if you'd like to answer, that'd be great.
All right.
So this is from David Mann. Do you have any examples of local ordinances that define or maintain and regulate pollinator gardens in suburban locations?
I hope not. I know there's a weed ordinance. There's often weed ordinances, but there are ways around that. If you make the garden look intentional, that usually gets by. And by intentional, it usually means establishing a nice edge. I know in my field in my backyard that I don't mow except once a year, I put a mowed path around the field and two paths through it to make sort of a cross, and then I put a concrete plinth and a rabbit on top. It looked intentional. And many years ago when there was a garden club plant tour, I found that people were not that, they liked the other parts of the garden, which took an awful lot of work to maintain and weed and all the rest. But the part that they really thought was most memorable was the meadow, and it had, and now it's goldenrod. But the lovely thing is, at this time of the year, I have lots of fireflies in there. My neighbor whose lawn is a little flatter, he has them at the edge of the yard, but I have them throughout my yard because that's an area where they can, so it's an added benefit for having it. As far as the ordinances, a native plant garden doesn't have to be messy. If you want, you can put the meadow in the back, or if you put it in the front and you have a mowed edge around it and, put a statue or something in there, mowed path through it, it will look intentional and it would get by there. I find it ironic that we would have weed ordinances for native plants, as opposed to some of the plants that are in our garden that become weeds in our native areas.
Okay. Excellent. And just remind everybody in the audience, if you have a question, please go ahead and submit it in the Q&A portion, and I will get to those questions shortly. Next is from Davida Foy Crabtree, and I live at Seabury, and we have 3 mason bee houses up, but this year we have no residents. Is there anything we should know?
Not sure. I mean, I do have my concern about the bee houses, because it does congregate the bees together, and if there's one sick bee, then they're all going to get sick. Usually in nature, they spread out more. So I'm not sure that we need those, but putting out logs and, anytime a tree loses a branch or something, leaving that down, working that into the garden would be, I think, much more beneficial than having a bee house. It's been dry. I'm not sure if that has had an influence on the mason bees. It's been hard for the flowers. So there are a lot of different factors that play into it. Also, where they might be wintering. There are a lot of different things.
Okay. This is also from Davida. It says, also, we have just developed a massive white aphid-like sucker infestation on a major pollinator hillside. It's
Yeah.
killing plants. What can we use to diminish the aphids while not hurting the pollinators?
Well, you can use a safer soap type thing. But one of the reasons probably why, and I've noticed, this white aphid thing, is because the plants are stressed. The plants are stressed because of the drought. And when a plant is stressed, just like people, it can't fight off things as well. So there's some plants that are sort of given towards aphids. I mean, the traditional cure for aphids is ladybugs. You can order ladybugs. You can try that technique, or lacewings. You release them where the aphids are bad, and they'll take care of the lady eggs. It's the larvae that tend to be the better ones for eating the aphids. But yeah, there's that approach. But it's the plant, because it's stressed. I bet, if you have another year where, the conditions are not so hard, you won't have the aphid problem, because plants can fight back. We tend to think of plants as being helpless, but plants are like little chemical factories. They can make all sorts of chemicals to protect themselves if given the right conditions.
Okay, excellent. Next question is from from Aaron Kazmekis. I'm sorry if I butcher names tonight. I do apologize. I have been cultivating a wildflower meadow and habitat yard, and all of my hard work earned me a lawn ordinance citation from Bloomfield last year, which I did go to explain successfully at the town hall, and I now have an NWF and pollinator pathways yard signs.
All right.
Is there anything else you suggest besides the signs to help educate town and neighbors and make communities more pollinator friendly?
Yeah, there are garden books out. It seems ironic that we can't have a native meadow because it's unsightly, but then people will go to meadows, as tourist attraction. Yeah, there are some design principles you can go. Douglas Tallamay and Richard Dark actually did a book on how to garden with native plants for the home landscape. But again, I would say mow the edge and, put up a statue in it. Look intentional. Make it look intentional. The signs are helpful, but mow around the edge. That somehow just neatens everything up and people like it. And put a path through it. And then they'll understand it. It's how you read the landscape. And landscape designers are always, talking about how to read the landscape. And those are some of the ways, the tricks that can be used. But it does seem strange that we have lawn ordinances in order to sustain biologically dead areas.
Right.
Yeah, and not healthy ones.
Okay. Next question is from Danielle Diermo. It seems like I've seen fewer pollinators this year. Do butterflies come later in the season?
They come at all seasons. There's some that only come at the beginning of the year. Some come in the middle and some come late. So it depends on the species. One species might only live for about 6 weeks during the year. So I think it's the drought. The fragmented habitat and the drought. Those are harsh on things. But I know I saw monarch butterflies earlier this year than last. Roaring Brook Nature Center, I think it might be, that's the 28th, is doing a Farmington Valley butterfly count. You can go to their website and they'll give you instructions on how to do a butterfly count if you're within a 15-mile radius of a certain point in the Farmington Valley. And even if you don't want to take part in that, Roaring Brook will post on their website the results, or you can get the results to you if you email us, on how many butterflies. And the butterflies do vary from year to year. A couple of years ago, we saw hardly any, like just a couple of monarchs. And then last year, it was actually a reasonably good year for monarchs. So a lot of the populations fluctuate dramatically based on the weather and the availability of the pollinating plants.
Excellent. This is from Stephanie Baramian. What is the value of butterfly weed and swamp milkweed to the butterfly?
Well, they're part of the milkweed family, and they are incredibly important to monarch butterflies. Not the other butterflies will drink the nectar from a milkweed plant. So if you have milkweed in your garden, it's got a beautiful flower, and the swamp milkweed is fantastic. It needs a little wet area, but it will attract all sorts of butterflies when it's in bloom. But the importance of the milkweed is for the monarch butterflies to lay the eggs so they can complete their life cycle.
Okay. This is from Elaine Shapiro. Does butterfly weed Asclepias
Tuberosa, yeah.
excuse me,
That's all right.
feed monarch caterpillars?
Yes, it does.
Excellent.
There's some southern monarch, southern milkweed plants, ones that are from Florida, and they look a little bit different than ours. There's some question about whether they feed the southern monarch butterfly genotypes or whatever. So I would stick to the butterfly weed and the common milkweed and the swamp milkweed for the gardens up here.
Okay, the next one's from David Mann. It says, terrific presentation. I've been to lots of plant lectures, and yours is very interesting with lots of new information. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next one's from Diana Moody. Mosquito Joe has become popular. How can we educate people to let them know that this kills the pollinators?
I don't know. We have such an uphill battle against the industries that, and people don't like mosquitoes, and understandably so. It's ironic, this year there aren't that many mosquitoes because there's not that much water standing around. It'd be easier to educate people to use mosquito dunks in any standing ponds they might have, or you can get in the hardware stores. They contain a bacteria that kills off the larva for the mosquitoes. Or to dump out water, any standing water around their house, and to replenish their bird baths on a regular basis. It takes about 3 days for the mosquito larvae to turn into mosquitoes. So if you keep up with dumping out things, you're not going to have those mosquitoes. So people tend to fixate on the mosquitoes. They fixate on the stinging bees and things like that because they're unpleasant. But there are ways around that other than spreading chemicals, and those chemicals have knock-on effects for all sorts of. They're not just targeting mosquitoes. They're targeting all sorts of things, and so education.
Okay. This is from Lorraine Cosgrove. How can we get rid of grubs without using GrubX?
Skunks. Well, they'll do a good job. They'll dig. I'm assuming that these are lawn grubs.
Yeah, I'm guessing so.
Yeah, don't water your lawn in June and July. Let your lawn go dormant. The life cycle for the Japanese beetle, which are the ones, there are a lot of grubs, and some of the grubs are just normal beetles that are not really going to do any problem. The ones that you're probably concerned about are the Japanese beetle grubs. I wouldn't use the Bacteriothorungus BT spores on the lawn because it does kill the other beetles, which are very important. Some of the beetles are great decomposers of wood, and they're just important parts of the insect food web. But if you've got grubs in your lawn, the biggest problem is keeping the lawn watered because that feeds the lawn and then feeds the grubs that are eating the things. So if you keep the soil dry, which you certainly have in the last couple of weeks, that sort of thwarts the development of those beetle grubs. So of course, people want nice green lawns, but lawns are meant to go dormant during this time of the year. And right now we're in a drought. Our groundwater levels are low. It's not a good idea to be watering your lawn anyway. And ecologically, when we water our lawns, we're taking water from the groundwater somewhere, and that's affecting a stream downstream and affecting the wildlife down there. So minimize your watering, and that will help keep down the grubs. Don't fertilize. Put in those other, put in the clover, put in the violets, have a biodiverse lawn, and it'll be much more. Train your neighbors to think that's okay too. But you'll have a much more sustainable, resilient lawn.
Okay. Next one's from Stephanie Bahramian again, and it's my city wanted me to clear away my brush pile, but I insisted that it had the purpose of providing habitat. So far, they've left me alone.
Is I mean, in the front yard, yeah, the town would have, but they were bothering you about it in the backyard, or?
It doesn't actually say if it was in the
Yeah.
backyard or not, but
Well, if you go on, and I love it, if you go on Google, you can, in the images, and you talk, and there are all sorts of creative brush piles. I mean, not brush piles, but log piles. I mean, people have been extraordinarily imaginative with their brush piles. They also have, maybe they have a lot of time on their hand. Some of us do at this particular junction because of the pandemic. But, you know, again, if you put a structure around it, make it look like, you know, that's the way you want it to go. Again, just, it's going to take people a while to train their eye to see lawns differently. Right now, everyone's eyes trained, everything has to be clipped and everything has to be, the new, you know, landscape design changes, and some of the new designs are a lot more loose and flowing and natural. And, you know, we're not planting begonias in straight lines around our house anymore, you know, and formalized, you know, planting beds of annuals. That was something that looked really good in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then it evolved into other things. So landscapes are constantly changing, and I think with education and training of the eye, it will be landscapes will change from having the gumdrop and rocket ship carved plants either side, you know, on the foundation, to a more naturalistic style of gardening that takes a lot less work and a lot less input.
Okay. This from Danielle Diermo. Thank you very much for the informative presentation. This is from Angelina Crossdale. Can you please distribute a list of plants we can buy to help these bees and butterflies? And I believe Sharon was talking about that earlier, correct?
Yeah, I have a list that's going to be distributed to everyone who attended this program. I think Dave Malesko is going to be sending it out tomorrow. On the list, there will be a list of resources from the state of Connecticut, how to do a pollinator garden. Because everyone's yard is different, it's very hard to specify a plant. It depends on your soil, it depends on how much sun you have, how much water your soils retain. So it's hard to say one plant in particular. If I had one plant to suggest, I would say mountain mint. If you have a sunny area, just plant mountain mint. It's just phenomenal. But there are all sorts of plants. There are some references in the sheet to nurseries. There are native plant nurseries. There's also, if you can't get to a native plant nursery, because there's just not that many in Connecticut, it's one of those cart before the horse. If you want the native plants, but you go to a nursery, they've all got the standard plants. You have to ask them for it. We have to do sort of a, no pun intended, grassroots movement to ask the nurseries to carry these native plants. And they should be able to find out for you what kind of plant would work in your yard. So I hesitate saying this type of plant. I mean, you know, if you plant zinnias or you know, a lot of the annuals, butterflies and bees will come. But if you want a more sustainable approach, I'd say the native plants. But in the handout that will be sent, there is also a list that if you can go to the local nurseries, ask for their native beauty plants. These are plants that are grown in Pride's Corner down in Durham, Connecticut, and they select plants for this area. And anything that's native beauty is a beautiful plant that was selected as a garden plant, but it's a native plant. And they have a fantastic website that will give a list of all sorts of plants that you could use for a butterfly garden. And then if you go to the nursery, sometimes they'll say this is a native plant. And sometimes it may not be a native plant. So if you're interested in using native plants, there's a lovely website called the United States Department of Agriculture Plant Database. And they have a fantastic site. You just type in the name of the scientific or the common name of the plant, and it will show you whether it's native to Connecticut, even down at the county level.
Excellent.
And that's on the sheet. So there's lots of information on the sheet.
And that's going to be emailed out to everyone tomorrow. So we'll get that out to you folks tomorrow. Next question is from Joanne Mitchell. I have an area I would like to grow into a meadow, but how do I keep trees and poison ivy from taking over?
Well, the poison ivy will probably come because it is a native plant, and then 40 different, or no, more than that, more than 40 different birds and animals actually eat the berries and eat the leaves, and it only causes problems for us. If you mow the field once a year, it'll help keep it controlled. But I know I've got poison ivy in my meadow. But if you mow the path, you don't go there. You can stay on the path, and you won't get the poison ivy. So poison ivy is a tough one. But if you mow it once a year, that will keep down the woody plants. That's the whole reason behind mowing. You think about a farm field. They had cows that would eat the small trees and things, and that's why it would be a grassland.
Okay. Next one is from Aaron Kosmeskis again. I have a large milkweed patch, and the leaves have dark brown spots on them this year.
Yeah.
Some of my friends want some of my milkweeds for their yard. Is it okay to share with my friends with these spots on them?
Yeah, it's probably some either, it could be, I don't know what particular plant problem it is having, but I'd say they're stressed because of the drought. And then when they're stressed, they can either get, they can get all sorts of things. But yeah, you could share them. And if you wait till the fall, you can give them the seeds. After the pods dry, open up, give them the seeds and have them plant them at that time of the year.
Okay. Next one is another poison ivy question. Poison ivy has taken over an open area that I want to convert to wildflowers. I'm highly allergic to it and can't remove it by hand. Is there an environmentally safe solution?
Well, aside from glyphosate, which is not environmentally safe, but aside from pulling it, which you're not going to do because you're highly allergic, you can try to convince someone else to suit up and pull it out. The best way would be to put have someone else mow it, and then put several layers of newspaper, about 6 layers of newspaper on top of it, and then put a mulch on top of that. And make sure you get all the edges, go way beyond where it is, because they send out runners. And that would smother it, and then plant it next year.
Okay. And I'm going to use that because I've got it all over my yard.
But it's a great food source for lots of different animals.
Oh, something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I know. I pulled out 6 large black bags of it. I suited up and pulled out large bags of it in my yard in a particular area where it was out of, then I've got another area where if you're not going to go in that area, just leave it. I mean, it is a great native plant. Yep. It's a beautiful color in the fall. Mm-hmm. Great food source. But really annoying.
Next one is from Stephanie Bahrainian again. Saw my first monarch on Saturday. None since then.
No. Now, monarchs have had trouble. I mean, they have to get to Connecticut, they have to go through an awful lot of farmland. And unfortunately, with our new farming practices, there are fewer edges on our farms, more and more commercial farms. And the herbicides that are used on the farms are, good at keeping the milkweed down. So it's a tough row for the thing. Also, a few years back, the monarch populations were devastated because of very severe weather, very severe winters in Mexico, in the area where so a lot of monarchs died at that point. And then there's concern of logging in the areas where the evergreen trees are that these monarchs go to. So there are a lot of problems for the monarch. And there's some, I think monarchwatch.org has very good discussions about what to do and why these monarchs, and they are cyclical populations. A few years back, it was really hard to find a monarch. And then last year was a much better year for monarchs. Whether they recovered sufficiently, I don't know.
Okay. This is from Peter Kyle. Is there a succulent, low water need plant that you find especially vital in this region?
Well, I mean, autumn joy sedum is a succulent plant. There are some native ones, stonecrop. I've never seen really big flowers on it, but the autumn joy is a great bee plant. I mean, it's not native, but it's I encourage everyone to go native, but there are some plants that are just easy to have in the garden. And autumn joy is one of those ones that looks good all year, even when it's not blooming. It's an attractive, well-maintained, easy to control plant. And after the flowers bloom, it's got great seed heads. It doesn't spread. So, just for the bees, I'd say autumn joy is a great succulent.
Okay. Stephanie Bomranian again. Do we have to have both male and female Lindera benzoin if we suspect there aren't any other in the area?
I'm not sure. I can't remember if that's dioecious or not. It's no, they are in the area. I mean, this is a very common plant, made more common by the fact that the deer don't like to eat them. I think even if you don't see them, they're in your area. So, yeah. And even if you had the males, I mean, they still, they still make flower, but not quite the same. But the, the berries are great.
Okay. This is from Beverly Harris. Do butterflies stay local or do they range all over?
Depends on the butterfly. I mean, obviously monarchs don't stay local. But no, they will go where the food source is. And, they don't have that long a lifespan. And one of the things I didn't talk about was the moths. We have some spectacular moths in Connecticut. You never see them, mainly because they come out at night. But some of them won't come to your garden because they don't have a mouth. They actually don't drink nectar. They just turn from caterpillars into egg-laying machines, and then they die. But they're still important from the food web, from feeding those baby birds. So even if you raise moths, it's still really important. A lot of those caterpillars are the ones that feed the birds. So we get fixated on the butterflies because we can see them, and they're pretty and lovely to have in the garden. But the moths, some of the moths are spectacular. Like the Luna moth, it's just great. But you'll never see it at your garden.
Okay, there was a second part to this question, and it's, is there any point in hatching monarch chrysalises and releasing them in your yard?
You mean keeping them inside? Yeah, they'll go out. And if they like your yard, and if they find milkweed, they will lay eggs on them. If they don't get snatched up by a young blue jay first. But yeah, you can hatch them. I like to leave the chrysalis outside. It's all part of the grand food web out there. But if you're concerned about them, you can try to do that. The big thing is you have to be very alert as to when they do come out of their chrysalis, if you've got them in a cage, because they'll be desperate to get outside. And if they don't have enough room when they come out of the chrysalis, their wings won't necessarily dry out right. They'll often be crumbled, or they might end up, in the few hours between the time that they hatched out and the time you found them, they might bash their wings against the cage in their desperate attempt to get out. And so they look a little worse for wear. So I think the best thing is to let them, don't take a chrysalis from outside and put it inside. And I think it's better just to leave them outside. Nature knows.
Okay. Our next one is from an anonymous attendee, and it's not really a question you can answer, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. Is there a way of getting our public works department to stop using an herbicide instead of mowing along the roadways? I would say it's probably something that you would have to call the Department of Public Works or go to a meeting.
Yeah, I think so. I know I'm on a conservation commission. We've asked our town a couple of times if they could come and talk to us about what kind of herbicides. I know I've had the explanation that they don't like to use it around the guardrails because there can also be broken glass in there, and if they do mechanical mowing, it's a little dangerous for the operators. So the herbicide's better around the guardrails. But I think we mow too much, and this attempt to make everything neat. I rather like it in the spring when you see the grasses the side of the road blowing. I don't know, why we can't wait till late fall to mow them down once. So I think it's an education. We've been trained how to do gardening a certain way, and it's hard to untrain. It takes a lot of education, and we have to come to the realization of why. The whole point is we have to understand why we're gardening the way we are. Some of it's just artifacts of old habits.
Okay. Next question's from Paula Jones. Should we be worried about a broad-necked root borer beetle? Saw one laying her eggs 2 days ago.
Is that the name of the beetle?
Yes, it says a broad-necked root borer beetle.
I don't know. I don't know that one. I guess, Paul, if it's non-native, I'd say yes, it's a worry. If it's native, I'd say, it's just part of the whole process. But
Okay.
I'm not familiar with that one.
And this is from Stephanie again, and it says yes in the backyard. I believe she was talking about going back to her wood.
And they were concerned about the brush pile in the backyard.
Yeah, that is strange because I've got a
Because
few.
who's going to see it? That's been a neighbor that was complaining about it. But yeah, put up a fence. I don't know. Or explain that this is a explain this is a habitat shelter, or put some sort of structure loosely around it and say, this is my put a sign on it, and everyone seems to think, oh, an educational sign on it, and oh, there's a reason for it. As long as people seem to know that there's a reason for it, or some sort of a some sort of looks like you've worked on it rather than just dumped your things there. They tend to be a little more forgiving.
Okay. Barbara Steele asked if this program's available to view the recording. I believe Dave will send out a link to it. We are recording it now, and it is being live streamed, so you should be able to find we should be able to get you a copy of that. Next one is from Stephanie. Can you give us the Latin name for mountain mint, please?
Oh, Pycnanthium. I think it was on the slide. But if you type in mountain mint into Google, they'll give you the. It's a funny spelling, Pycnantheum or something like that. Yeah, that's the one name. One of the Latin names that I always have troubles pronouncing.
Next question is from Erin Keenan, and she is coming to us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Wow.
And she's asking, what are some natural ways to reduce vegetable garden pests without harming pollinators?
Well, companion planting, things like marigolds, and if you plant a lot of flowers, it'll bring in some of a lot of the stinky flowers, like marigolds. I mean, strong smelling. I don't mean stinky in a nasty smell, but there are all sorts of companion planting things. I think there was a book years ago that said, carrots like dill. If you make a diverse thing, and then put up some things, nesting materials, birdhouses, any way you can attract birds to your yard, that will help with the insects as well. Yeah, garden plants, vegetable plants are hard because they have been bred to be tasty to us, and often they're tasty to insects. In the wild, like the wild potato has lots of nasty chemicals in it to keep it from being eaten. A lot of wild plants will do that. But we have bred those nasty chemicals out of them, so they make it much more tasty for the insects, so they'd be tasty to us too. So vegetable gardens are hard, but there are scads of books on how planting things. Put the herbs in there with them, and there are books that are out there that tell about that. I'm not particularly. I've given up on vegetable garden because of the deer, the raccoons, the squirrels, the rabbits.
The overpopulation of deer does make it very difficult in this day. I swore I saw an 8-foot-high fence the other day. And so,
yeah. And I've got a farm down the street. I figured they know what they're doing. So, yeah.
Okay, this is from Ginger Harris. Awesome presentation. Thank you. I have a pollinator meadow here in Bloomfield. Some folks have expressed concern about the larger animals this may create habitat for. Is there a positive way to field this fear my friends and neighbors have of sharing our yard with nature?
Yeah, they do. And it's interesting. I work in a nature center, and half the people phone up to say, how much they love an animal, how can they attract it. The other half phone up to say, I hate these animals, how can I keep them out of my yard? The biggest concern for a meadow is probably the mice and the little tiny rodents. one of the solutions for that is, they are great food for things like hawks and owls. One of the solutions I saw for that was to put a stand with a little crossbar on it, up in the provide a great perch for the owls and the hawks to stand and wait for the mice to come out. So that's a possibility. But as far as the other animals, most of the animals we have, the larger animals, they're not going to be interested in meadows particularly. And if it's, coyotes would come, but they'll move through. I mean, they don't stay. None of our animals really stay in our backyard. Fox will come through, but all these things are part of the process of eliminating some of the things that we should be more worried about, the mice than we worry about the larger animals. The larger animals are coming to keep the mouse population under control. And the mice would be the ones that carry the ticks or the Lyme disease. So anytime you bring those larger animals in, and actually you want to encourage possums into your yard because they're very good at eliminating ticks. They when they groom themselves, they eat the ticks, and they reduce the number of ticks in your yard. So some animals you want to increase in your yard. Again, they decrease the number of ticks in your yard. Possums do. They're like
Possums, interesting.
possums. Mm-hmm.
All right. Angelique Crossdale Mills, how do you encourage bees to move from a well-trafficked area to a more suitable place in your yard?
Well, you'd have to move the plants.
Okay.
Because the bees will go where the plants are. So if the bees are at consider moving the garden.
Stephanie is also championing poison ivy has an excellent ecological value.
Does. Yes.
Jane M., thank you for this wonderful session, super informative. I've asked Public Works the same question about chemical use and have had no response. Paula Jones, beetle is native, thank you.
Oh, good, all right. Part of the rich tapestry.
Speaking of bees, I've got one buzzing the tower now. What are your thoughts on backyard beehives? And that's from Peter Kyle.
Well, yes. Now, bees, bees are not native, so, sometimes they compete with their native bees for things. But if you want honey and wax, definitely go for a beehive. The big problem, we have is bears. So you'd need some sort of a fence strong enough to keep the bear out. So, some of these things which would be lovely to have are difficult in our area because we do have a wealth of wildlife, and it's how we coexist with them. So I wouldn't necessarily bring. I don't see the need to bring in a beehive because we have native bees, and I think they're fine. And because they're not colony things, the honeybees would be more protective of their nest, their colony. So I'm not particularly interested in having them nearby. But if you want, you certainly could do it. But there are Connecticut apiary websites that will tell you how to do that.
Okay, we're down to our last couple of questions. Let's see. This is from Stephanie. Luis Riot is the companion planting book you were thinking of. One of my go-to books.
Okay, all right.
Also from Stephanie, carrots love tomatoes.
Oh, there you go. All right. Yeah.
And then this is the last one. It's from Aaron Kazmekis, and it's thank you, great workshop. And again, I want to thank you, Marjorie. It was a fantastic workshop. I was able to learn a lot, and I'm sure the rest of the audience was. And again, I'd just like to thank our partners with this, the Wittenberry Land Trust, and again, Marjorie Winters, and obviously the Brook Nature Center the Roaring Brook Nature Center in Canton, and the Simsbury Land Trust, the Town of Bloomfield, the Bloomfield Beautification Committee, and the Conservation Energy and Environmental Committee, as well as the Simsbury Land Trust. And Sharon, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to say, or Marjorie, if you've got any closing thoughts for us, or.
I'd like to just say one thing. I want to thank everybody for coming. And if you have an opportunity to take a stroll into downtown Bloomfield, the center, the BBC has been working on pollinator gardens throughout the town. And we hope that people will, take a walk and see them, and they will be encouraged to do the same in their own gardens. We will be eventually putting up little signs so you'll understand or know what the names of the plants are. And thank you again, Marjorie. You were awesome. Love Doug Ptolemy, and you really brought a lot of new insight to even as many years as I've been gardening, new things that I didn't know before.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
That was fantastic. And then Stephanie just said that Carrots Love Tomatoes was the name of the book that we're putting out there for everybody else. So for everybody tuning in, thank you so much for coming out and joining us for this webinar. You have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.